Okay, so welcome everybody to the check-in meeting. We've got two important pieces of work to get through today. We have opted to go through the measurement item first, really to make sure that we allow the maximum amount of time for discussion and feedback on the draft climate-related disclosures uh, uh, material. So I think without further ado, Ross, unless there's anything you want to do administratively, I will pass over to Agostina, who's going to take us through the measurement material.
Nothing from me, and thanks.
Okay, so over to you, Agostina.
Thank you, Ian. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night to some of you. Thank you for making the time. I will share screen, so I will just ask for just 1 second. And I think you can see my screen right now.
We can.
Okay. So on agenda item 1, we're discussing 2 agenda papers. One of them is the instructions from the March meeting that staff has addressed and made edits to the ED, which we did a page flip during the March meeting. The idea for the discussion of this agenda item is to discuss the instructions by exception. And I will note some of the comments that I have received offline of members who were not able to attend the meeting due to a conflict. So the first change that was made was regarding to the title of the ED, just the exclusion of the amendments to a specific IPSAS, as to ensure that constituents know that there was considerations outside of the amendments made to certain IPSAS, such as the applicability of COV for right-of-use assets. The IPSASB also made the decision on the applicability of COV across IPSAS that were not amended. So the table at the front of the ED was expanded to reflect both decisions where the IPSASB decided that COV applies and therefore amendments were made, or COV does not apply and there was no amendments made for those IPSAS. Certain part of Appendix B of IPSAS 46 was amended to ensure further clarity on the least costly manner, and we worked offline with the particular member who suggested those edits. Then also there was the addition of current value measurement disclosures in IPSAS 21, aligned to the ones that IPSAS 46 included to IPSAS 26. And also on the paper, we discussed the task force meeting during the March meeting regarding the additional questions on the applicability of COV on IPSAS 31, specifically to clarify and communicate that within the scope of the measurement application project, recognition principles in IPSAS 31 were not on scope, and therefore those have not been amended or within the scope of the project. Similarly to that, there was a suggestion for the IPSASB to wait until the ISB completes its project on IS38 intangible assets. The the ISB recently started their work on IS38 comprehensive review, and because COV is a public sector specific measurement, the thought from the task force and staff is that conclusion of that project would not look into the applicability of COV as to delay this decision, as well as to say that since they just simply started with the project, we're not certain when they're going to conclude that project as to further delay this decision that is specific to the public sector. The other consideration, IPSAS 31, was whether a similar restriction that is placed on fair value should be placed on COV, specifically in IPSAS 31, when there is the fair value has to be determined by a reference to an active market. And the question was whether this should be applied for COV as well. The measurement task force decided that it should not apply because it's different in the sense that the reason why in intangibles there's a requirement for fair value to make a reference to an active market is that intangibles, particularly internally generated intangibles, tend to be unique and specific to an entity, and therefore finding an exit price was not considered to be able to be reliably assessed, while COV is an entry value, and therefore the measurement task force thought that that restriction was not applicable to COV, as it is an entry value, and the expectation will be that a measurement that is a reliably measure can be assessed via the use of the cost approach. The two other instructions were to expand on basis for conclusions, specifically on the analysis conducted by the decision by the IPSASB that the scope of the project for assets within inventories, where now the proposal is for this to be measured at the lower cost of COV when they're held for operational capacity. Did not result in an unintended day 2 movement, because the principle of measurement within IPSAS 12 is to measure inventories at the lower of 2 costs. So this was not driven by replacing current replacement costs with current operational value. And then additionally, further details were provided about the applicability of COV for right-of-use assets when an entity applies IPSAS 45. And then there were some editorial comments. To that, I just want to share some comments that I received offline. Andrew shared with us that he's still of the view that there's further work to be done on IPSAS 31 and does not agree with the applicability of COV at this time. And with that, I will just ask to the board if they agree that the March 2024 IPSASB instructions were actioned accordingly by staff. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina, for that introduction. Thanks to staff and to the task force for considering all those remaining issues and responding to the instructions from the board meeting. I think there's a further discussion to be had with Andrew offline, so I think if we can ask you to go into that offline before the June meeting. So I want to take any other comments from board members at this stage where they have any concerns of principle in terms of how staff have implemented the instructions from the March board meeting. So not seeing any hands raised. So I think then, Agustina, what we will do is then move into the section by section review of the updated draft. Okay, thanks for that, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Ian. So from a section and section review of the document, we did a walkthrough in March, but I think what I'll do, I'll just break it by parts. So on part 1, if there's any comments on part 1 of the ED, specifically on the applicability of COV.
So obviously, if there are any editorials that anybody's picked up, pass those offline to staff. Are there any points then on part 1 of the exposure draft that members want to raise at this stage? Well, Renee.
I'm sorry. Good day, everyone. I'm looking for my virtual hand. I can't find it on my screen. Yes. I have a comment in the BC related to IPSAS 3. So I totally agree with the change. Of course, it's more the way that we've addressed the editorial. I think that we should still refer to then why the basis, the change in or actually there's no longer a change in a basis, because now of the new logic, there's a change in the measurement model between historical cost and revaluation. And then within the revaluation model, there is a choice that we make that is based on the intention of how the asset is being used, right? To select the basis. and I find that it's not coming out that explicitly. So I felt more needed to be articulated in the BC 18 or 19. I'm not too sure which one. So I can work with staff to help provide the drafting that I would think would enhance the explanation.
Okay, thanks, Renee. Well, yeah, I think if we have that instruction to work with staff, and then obviously any final changes arising from edits identified or changes we agree to today will appear in markup in the version that we see back in June. So thanks, Renee, for that. Any other comments on part one? So that's pages 9 to 32 that we're looking at the moment. Okay, so we move on then to part two, which is the IPSAS 21 proposed amendments, which is pages 33 to 55. Any comments on the changes that have been made there to the document? Okay, not seeing any hands raised. So let's move on then to part three of the document, pages 56 to 71. Okay, again, not seeing any hands raised. So then we move on to part four, which is pages 72 to 85. Okay, and then if we just come back to the SMCs, so I know there is still some debate backwards and forwards about, I think it's SMC2, Agustina?
Yes, that is correct. On SMC2, there was 3 SMCs proposed on the paper. And then specifically, we were shared by one of the members raised the question that on SMC2, the question does not specifically ask whether the income approach is needed for COV to be applicable for right of use assets. So that's the question that we have received. At this time, how the SMCs has been drafted has been to be specific on whether the constituents think that COV is applicable for assets held for operational capacity, specifically for IPSAS 12 and IPSAS 31, and we have a similar one for IPSAS 43. But because the income approach is not within IPSAS 46, the thought from staff was not to add that to the SMC, but that's one of the questions raised by a member, whether we should be explicit on that based on an instruction. So I'll open it for comment, Chair. Thank you.
So a number of members have contributed to this discussion, and I think it's actually a matter of tactics as to whether we are explicit or not. If we are explicit, this is not the income approach. The board decided not to include that in IPSAS 46. So it seems quite strange to have essentially a referendum on whether we include something which we can't do through this project anyway. That would be a separate narrow scope amendment if people came back and said it. But so I think there's a further debate that needs to be had just on that final piece of wording. So I'm suggesting that we bring that back with any amendments agreed through the discussion with the relevant members to the June meeting. But just to acknowledge that that debate is ongoing at the moment. Okay. Agustina, go ahead.
Yes, I think if I could ask just the board, the IPSASB, if there's any comments on SMC1 and SMC3 proposed at this time, acknowledging that SMC2 will be deferred to the June meeting.
Camilla.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Agustina. Yes, I do have a comment on SMC3. I think we should make it clearer that here COV is replacing value in use. Maybe for the readers just at the first point already know, because maybe it's not clear enough, okay, what do we mean by branch of recoverable service amount? So if we make it clear in the question that basically the proposition is that COV replaces value in use in IPSAS 21. Thanks.
Okay, so I think staff, instruction is to staff to work with Camira just in terms of finessing the wording.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other points on SMCs at this stage? Okay. Any other points members want to raise at this stage on the exposure draft? The plan will be that other than just checking that there are no concerns with the revised drafting arising from the points raised today and in subsequent work offline with members, that we will move quickly to a vote on the exposure draft during the session in June. So there won't be any further debate on particular items at that stage. We'll just move quickly through to the formal approval. So any other points anybody wants to raise at this stage? Yep, Camira.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, I had a couple of comments, but I will share them with the staff offline. But mainly, my main concern when reading this exposure draft is that we are removing now a lot of guidance on the depreciated replacement cost approach, and we are replacing it with, okay, the current operational value. I think the depreciated replacement cost is much more understandable and less abstract in comparison to the COV. So perhaps is there a way to keep some of the guidance or about the depreciated replacement cost approach as a technique to calculate the COV? Because I think otherwise we are losing useful information and we are replacing with something abstract. As COV is something new that nobody clearly understands or has applied in practice. So I think if we could save somehow the depreciated replacement costs, perhaps inside of the measurement technique of cost approach or something, so that we can still be able to clarify basically what we mean with COV, how it is calculated. Because as of now, even if in the illustrative examples, the COV is like given already. So yeah, so that is only like a suggestion from my end. Thanks.
Thanks, Camilla. So, I mean, essentially, this is about the application of COV as set out in IPSAS 46. And there is guidance in IPSAS 46, which talks about the cost approach, which essentially is DRC. So I think we've already included appropriate guidance in IPSAS 46, and this project isn't about are there any issues with the guidance in 46. It's about can COV be applied. So I think unless there are any tweaks to basis for conclusions, just to make it clear, that would help address your point, I think then if there are any concerns, it's actually about the application of the guidance in IPSAS 46. And then what we would do is that would come into, assuming we do a post-implementation review, I think that would be the stage at which we'd look at that. So I think there's a limited amount that we can do here because we already have 46 and it's about the application of 46. So if there's anything you see in basis for conclusions which is unclear, without adding a lot of extra text, I'd suggest that you have an offline discussion with staff on that.
Yeah, okay.
Tricia.
And thank you. I have shared my comments with the staff, and some comments is related to better articulation of IPSAS 46. I consider these comment editorials, but if it's necessary, I can raise some main concerns here. For example, hierarchy.
I would rather
Okay.
there needs to be a discussion with staff about whether they're
Okay.
actually in scope or not, because what we're not doing here is actually making significant amendments to IPSAS 46. This is about the application of IPSAS 46
Yeah.
COV as written. So I think there's a fine line here, and what I'd rather you do is actually have a discussion offline with staff, and if there are any changes that need to be made, then procedurally staff can discuss and agree and then bring back any final recommendations into the June meeting.
Yes, because I think it's only editorial because it's a better articulation. It's not for principle or for discuss some decision we have made in previous meetings. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think if we take that approach, then hopefully we've got a formed view to bring back to the board in June. Okay, so I think that brings us to conclusion on the first item on the agenda. Agustina.
Yes, if I could ask members, thank you for the members that have provided me editorial comments already on the drafting. If there's any incremental beside the items that I need to action with particular members that it was discussed today, I would appreciate and ask for your editorial and comments on drafting by Friday, May 24th of next week, as to allow us to have a ED in good shape for the June meeting for approval. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for reminding us on that, Agustina. Okay, so with that, we'll conclude item 1, and then we move on to item 2 on climate-related disclosures. And before I hand over to Celine, I'll go to you, Ross.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and thanks members for the time today. I think we've put a lot of work into getting today's item on sustainability ready for board discussion, and really looking forward to this discussion. But before we get into that, I've got some good news to announce on resources, in that we've got a new member of the team who's joining us for the first time today. Karen Lung, who's online, joining us from Singapore at the moment, but will soon be joining us full-time in Toronto. So very, very happy to have another resource dedicated to sustainability on the team. And Karen comes to us with a sustainability background, having spent time working at EY in their advisory group, and currently finishing up a master's in sustainability studies in Singapore. So we were lucky to have Karen join us in Toronto last week and work with us on a number of issues related to sustainability. And she'll be back to visit us for a couple of weeks at the end of May and June as we prepare for the June session. And we're just really happy to have more resources available to support the work and help us meet our goal of approving the exposure draft in September. And we know we've got a lot to do, but we feel we've made a lot of progress, and really looking forward to input from board members today that will help us continue to make progress. So with that, welcome to the team, Karen, and back to you, Ian.
Okay, thanks, Ross. That is very good news, and Karen, sincere welcome on behalf of the board. We really look forward to working with you, and I know you've already contributed on the metrics side, which we'll be picking up and discussing in June. So very welcome. Okay, so Celine, over to you to introduce the item.
Thank you. So let me share my screen. So we'll go through the 3 agenda papers: project management, use of terms of outcomes, and then we'll do the section by section review. So as Ross said, we've come a long way, but there's a lot to do till September. It's great to have Karen on board, and we're moving ahead towards this June meeting. But this first agenda paper is really just to provide the board roadmap on the next upcoming milestones to get to that September approval. And so, you know, at our March meeting, we reviewed, we had already board decisions on objective scope. We reviewed governance strategy risk management, and we had some breakout sessions on the remaining metrics and transitional provisions. Through this month, we met with the SRG, and we're meeting with last week, and we're meeting with topic working group next week to really refine a lot of those concepts that we talked about in March. And we'll be bringing those back to the board in June, together with an education session that will be held at the CAG meeting on the Monday, June 24th. So board members are always welcome to join that and participate. And it will be a session really focused on implementation and what the public sector can take away from the private sector's learnings, and then also government, a national country that is looking and planning their sustainability reporting and how they're going about that. So that will come at the education session on June 24th, and then we'll, at the board meeting, plan to bring the full ED to the board. And that is our intention. We'd like to get the board through the full ED. That will bring in the new drafting on metrics and targets, general requirements, which covers sources of guidance, location of reporting, timing, etc., and then transitional provisions based on our discussions in March. And so that's what we're working towards. And from June, hopefully we'll have a good handle, but there will certainly be some remaining issues. So after the June meeting, those additional issues, we're going to focus on the key major ones that we can tackle and work together with the SRG and the topic working group around those, and then bring it back to the July check-in. So that will be intended to be a very focused discussion on major issues. And to add, there'll also be editorials. This ED is a work in progress. What you have is a work in progress. And so we do intend to set up a drafting group to work through editorials and drafting following the June meeting. And so with that, we'd come back in September. We'd have hopefully addressed the major issues in July, and then bring it back for the board to review in September and approve. And that'll be the final draft ED. We'll plan to, we'll have some time during that meeting to work through any minor items, and then approve the SMCs as well. So, I can pause there if you want to.
Yeah, thanks very much, Celine. And just to underline 2 points. The first is that we are intending that there will be an entire day available for really walking through in detail the full exposure draft in the June meeting. So there'll be plenty of time then to pick up on issues and so on as we go through the June meeting. And similarly, we are anticipating that we will need plenty of the agenda in the September meeting to bed down the final issues. The second point is on the formation of the drafting group. This was a type of group that we used very successfully on both the measurement in the final stages of the measurement project, and also with revenue and transfer expenses. And basically what it allowed staff to do was work with a group of the members who had a key interest in this, really to nail down the drafting, not to change decisions made by the full board, but to ensure that they were implemented clearly, and that the explanations were clear, and so on. And we think that in the context of where we go after June, between June and September, that could be a really important additional group in our armory, because it's really making sure that the drafts that come back for the September meeting truly do reflect board members, what's been decided at the board, and that that sort of subset of the board actually is content that they are then expressed appropriately and clearly. So perhaps, Celine, if you just stop sharing your slide at that point in time, and I'll just open up for any comments on how we're proposing to work through that process. Okay, that's good, and you know, there'll be plenty of time for discussion and debate both inside the board meeting, and there will be a board in camera session at the beginning and end of the June meeting as well. Okay, so I think with that then, Celine, move us into the second paper.
All right, so on the second paper, we're talking about moving to outcomes, but the first slide here, you may recognize it from March. We shared this as well with the SRG and got a lot of strong support. So, you know, the approach we're taking, and we agreed in March to delineate our guidance between own operations and policy activities, with an approach to align own operations really very much with IPSASB, and then develop public sector specific guidance on policy activities. So I just wanted to share the SRG feedback for this was very strong support. There was very strong support with aligning with private sector guidance, you know, from very much from a capital market significance of the public sector, and also just understandability of the disclosures. And so it was really, you know, very welcome by the SRG to take that approach, aligning with the private sector guidance. And then also equally strong support that, you know, policy activities is a critical area for us to be focusing on. And so what we discussed and shared in March was really how to think about risks and opportunities and impacts across these two different areas. And I think coming out of the March meeting, we had a bit of a further reflection amongst the staff, because when we talked about impacts, there was some confusion, I think clarity needed. And so we really tried to reflect on, okay, what's the right approach? How do we think about this? And coming out of that meeting and the research we did further and further thinking, we wanted to propose to the board to use the term outcomes as a result of climate-related policies instead of impacts. And so that came from a few different reasons, and one of them, I think a big part is looking to our own literature. So you'll recall this framework that we established back in March 2023, so a year ago now, and we wanted to look to our conceptual framework, but we proposed to also look at, you know, IPSAS literature, and this was something noted at the SRG as well, to make sure we have make those ties to IPSAS literature, and make those linkages between financial reporting and sustainability reporting. And so given we have RPG1 and RPG3, we've, you know, they've been through our due process and been reviewed, improved, and even last year just updated to amend and clearly emphasize its relevance to sustainability. And so we would look to RPG3 in this case on the term outcomes. So outcomes can help to address some of the confusion we see in the reporting space around impacts. So we do see there's different interpretations or inconsistent definitions of impacts, which may create some confusion. And so instead, we base the terminology and the concept in our own literature, using the term outcomes from RPG3, backed by our conceptual framework. I think it gives us that framework to think about it within the purview of your primary users, the need to focus information disclosures on the user's decision-making and accountability information needs. It also, outcomes also has in RPG3, like some boundary on thinking about what's reasonably attributable to the actual activities. And so that helps us to frame it within our own literature. So when you look at the definition of outcomes in RPG3, it is the impacts on society which occur as a result of or are reasonably attributable to the entity's outputs. Outputs is defined as services provided to an entity to recipients external to the entity. And so when we think about how to interpret this for our standard, we would look at outcomes are the impacts on society, being economy, environment, and people, given we know the interrelated relationship between environment, economy, and people. We think that this broader definition, the impacts on society, would apply to that broader definition. And certainly outputs, one of the services provided is policy activities. So policy activities being an output. And so when we presented this to the SRG, we also got really strong support on this. They were supportive of, you know, the rationale to couch it in our own literature, the support that it's well understood in the public sector, and so I think that overall the direction was really well supported. I think we'll continue to work through it. They did provide some feedback on, you know, providing more examples, which we'll work through as well. But overall, our recommendation would be then to clarify, replace, instead of using climate-related impacts on the economy, environment, people, we'll focus on outcomes related to climate-related policy activities.
Okay, so Celine, if you take the slide down, and then we'll open up for discussion. Just before we do, couple of extra points in terms of locating this discussion. Firstly, you know, certainly there might be potential concerns over the non-mandatory status of RPG1 and RPG3. On that, obviously, we have committed during the discussions on the draft strategy that the status of those pieces of guidance would be something that we would need to reconsider whether they become mandatory, you know, as we move into developing sustainability reporting standards. The other point to that is that essentially the non-mandatory status of recommended practice guidelines was a rather uneasy compromise that the board arrived at probably around about 2011 time, where you know, there was concern that if we made them part of the IPSAS series, then that could have an impact on implementation and adoption of IPSAS. So it was a kind of compromise at that stage. And, you know, the fact that there was still a debate about the status, indeed, one member voted against the approval of RPG1 purely because he believed strongly that it should be mandatory. So I think just bear that in mind in terms of the reaction to the literature. And I think probably the other thing which is worth just locating in the broader landscape is certainly there were concerns from board members when we had the discussion about that framework with the bringing in of GRI guidance. Members had a concern at that stage in March last year about, does this take us too broad? Is this operational? Can you operate this or not? Obviously, this actually gives you something that ties into the activities and fits with primary user, being accountable to primary users and supporting decision making more tightly. Plus the side benefit, which is it ties it in with the sort of ideas around integrated thinking, integrated reporting. So just with those additional points to note there in the broader environment, I'll open it for comments from board members. Andrew, to you first, and then to Patricia.
Thanks, Ian. So I do agree with the recommendation to use outcomes rather than impacts. I note the discussions and the considerations in the paper, and I think based on my reading and understanding, I think it ties into a little bit of what you were saying now. Outcomes is narrower by my understanding than what impacts is, in that it's more of an intentional aim that I've tried to achieve, and it's also very much only a downstream rather than looking at upstream potential impacts around the decision as well. I do agree with that, because I do think, as you say, we are concerned in the March meeting that going to impacts may be too broad, particularly as an initial step for the standard. I just think that it's really important that we flag this to stakeholders when we do this, particularly because in the CP, we did go out and hear back or propose that it would be GRI, IPSASB, a conceptual framework. And if we are removing sort of that GRI leg and limiting the sort of outcomes now, I think that's very important communication and messaging that needs to go to stakeholders. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. I mean, I think that is very important. And in a sense, actually, I think we're bridging to that GRI concept in terms of impacts. But you're right to say it actually is a narrower concept because it actually relates it into activities. So you're right, we need to be very careful about that communication, being clear about that. Patricia, and then Angela.
Thank you. I agree with the use of the definition at RPG 3, but I have concerns about the articulation of this definition with the other elements in the standard, specifically about the definition of own operations and policy activities. Why? Because considering the draft in this state, the policy activities only part of the policies, but not all policies. For example, in the examples presented in the AGs and other parts of the text, policy activities related to allocation of expenditure, current expenditure, not capital expenditure, is not in the scope of the policy activities. And the main way of the entities impact society is from the is based on handling services, and handling services include other kinds of expenditure, not only capital expenditure, or to change legislation or tax legislation and so on. And then my view, it's in this moment we are using a so narrow concept of policy activities, and consequently some kind of relevant impact or relevant outcomes from the entities. Public entity is not in the scope of these climate-related disclosure. I can articulate better when you discuss the draft, but my main concern is about this, because operation, some entities set policies and other entities implement. Implement is related to own operations. Own operations give rise outcomes, but the outcomes is not considering it when I in the disclosed climate related disclose about own operations, because the focus is on the fiscal sustainability. And when I consider the other policy activities, because I can consider, the entity set the policies, and then you control and monitor and disclose about the outcomes produced by the entity, but other entities, but it's not occurring considering this state of this draft. And I think some relevant outcomes in this moment can be outside of the scope of disclosed climate related. And the other, no, I think it's the main concern is this. I think it's better articulate, because the output is normally provided by the own operations, and output is not connect with the outcomes, because outcomes is related with some kinds of policy activities, not all policy activity that the public sector can perform. Thank you.
Yes, Patricia. I mean, I think that's, it's those areas that we want to pick up in the discussions today, where members have concerns about how do we tie these things together and how does it work in practice. And certainly, I've following the discussion that we had in March, this idea about how do risks and opportunities work with if we move to calling them outcomes for policy activities. There may be some additional clarification that we need to bring into what's in S2, and certainly in discussion with IPSASB, they were certainly willing to help us work with, to help work with us in terms of perhaps making some things more explicit that are perhaps implicit in their guidance at the moment. Angela. Oh, you're on mute at the moment, Angela.
Someone had to do it. Thank you, Ian. I just wanted to, from my perspective, I agree with the staff recommendation. I didn't see it as a major issue. I could see that impacts, given it has a number of different meanings across different frameworks in this area. I think it is important to address that concern. I like using something within our own framework and being consistent. But I guess within this standard, and I think it's a challenge generally when we're pulling material for specific purposes from other places and then popping it in. And so my reactions were more around the fact that the definitions of outcomes and outputs, they're quite prescriptive within a service performance reporting environment. And so one of the things that struck me immediately is when we talk about outcomes, our impacts on society, so there's some kind of result or consequence of some kind of action, in this case, outputs. And then I sort of bring that into the climate-related disclosure, where we want an entity under their climate-related policy activities, we want to say, what are the outcomes that could be reasonably expected? So my immediate thought is this, in our RPG definition, it's the impacts on society. But I don't think we mean the impacts on society as a whole. So I guess I just wanted to flag that there are some definitional issues in just picking things up. And so I'm a little bit concerned that, in my view, using outcomes is just a more comfortable public sector term within our framework. And I'm questioning around, does either we have to explain the definition from RPG in a way to focus on climate impacts, or do we just acknowledge that it's a more comfortable term and it's consistent with the idea of an action and a consequence in RPG service performance, which is what we're really looking for here in the climate standard. So agree, but cautious around just lifting things, particularly when in certain jurisdictions, service performance reporting is quite a prescriptive activity and those definitions are used very specifically. So just wanted to flag that, really.
Thank you, Angela, and I can understand where you're coming from, particularly on that point on society. And I think probably if we instruct staff to have a further think about how we communicate the application and explain that in basis for conclusions, and what I would suggest is that we do come back and have another look at that when you've seen updated drafting and just see where, what people feel at that stage. So I think if we have that as an action. So Murray.
Yes, thank you. I agree with staff's recommendation. However, I'm in confusion in the wording of the operation and the policy activities. And so maybe these two operations and policy activities are linked together, and so maybe I'm also in confusion in the climate related risks and opportunities, and especially the opportunities, it is related to the policy activities, and so maybe we have to clarify what is the scope of the operation. It's broader, and so what is related to the policy activities, and also I'm in confusion in the definition of the output in the RPG 3, and it is the recipient. The word is recipient, and in this point, we have to include, engage so many multi-stakeholders, and so we have to redefine the recipient, the definition of the recipient, and so we have to consider about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And I think we'll look shortly at sort of definitions that have been included or proposed for policy activities and for own operations. And I think, they're clearly, we are going to have to think about this in the context of, can we provide the clarity that will help constituents with the problems that you're articulating? So I think, when we walk through the text, if you remind us where there are particular areas where you have a concern at the moment when it pops up in the drafting, that would be really helpful. And then I think when we come back in June, then we can have a look at actually, does this now hang together, or is there more that we need to actually do on that? So what I'm hearing now is all the members that have spoken have supported that move to using outcomes, and the consistency with our existing literature. I think we have concerns over how we communicate that change overall, and also some more specific concerns about how do we make sure that this hangs together internally within the document and we explain that. And I think we're going to have to test that. Can we get the clarity that people are looking for within the document, or is there a case that we actually have to go further? You know, and Angela raised the point about society. Do we need to actually raise that, you know, higher in terms of, you know, perhaps a change? But I think we should only go there if we can't actually articulate how these things work at the moment, based on the fact it's already a known term within our literature. So, are there any other comments board members want to make? I think we've got, you know, basically I'm sensing agreement to the change with those provisos. Any other points anybody wants to make before we move into the document? Okay, that's good. So thank you very much, everyone. So I think, Celine, if you want to move us on to the walking through the document and how we want to approach that in order to get the maximum amount of comments from members.
Yep, sounds good. So before we go into the section by section review, I just want to share, you know, a summary. You know, it was a big document. I hope you all had the ability to navigate through. So, you know, just to recap, we have the core text, the application guidance, the general appendix, requirements appendix, which is all of that from S1 that we're bringing in, and then our basis for conclusions to support all of those. And so across these, how we're going to look and discuss, when we discuss section by section, we'll look straight across all the different areas. So governance, when we are going to discuss governance, we will look at governance across the core text, application guidance, basis of conclusions. So we'll work through it section by section in that way, rather than the columns across. And then for the structure of each section, you'll see we've separated, just for clarity, the own operations from the policy activities. So the own operations, you know, where we're leveraging S2, it's clear, it's highlighted in blue. It comes first, and then policy activities follow. So for section by section, just to delineate, you know, we know that there was feedback that there'll be likely more entities with own operations, and clearly separating policy activities for those that applies for will help preparers to really separate and know what applies for them. So we've done that through the core text and the application guidance, with explanations for those in the general requirements appendix and the basis for conclusions. So with that sort of approach, the key feedback that we wanted to really focus on and yet is really focus on substantive points. You know, what are some principles that require further articulation and that we need to consider? On own operations, I think ultimately, you know, with the decision to align with S2, we want to focus on what's those really public sector specific adaptations or changes needed to help apply S2. So in most cases, you'll see the core text is, you know, taken from S2, and then we'll have application guidance to think about how you apply that in the context of public sector. And then policy activities. This is all of the drafting was really based on the feedback that we got from breakout sessions. And so if there's anything additional that we think is needed to articulate and to provide guidance on public sector policy activities, those are really where we want to focus on these net new policy specific sections. And so maybe I'll turn it to Ian, if you had anything to add, and we'll go section by section.
Yeah, thanks, Celine. So obviously what we're trying to do is give, you know, you the opportunity to feedback your reactions to, you know, seeing the drafting essentially for the first time, although the objective section and scope and definitions I think we have seen before, as you've shown in the document. We've got a lot to get through today, so if members can make sure that they're succinct in the point that they want to raise, and what we will likely do is actually just take rounds of comments, and rather than kind of debate the solution at this stage, what we may do then is take them offline, ask staff to work with a group of members that have the concerns in those areas, and then to bring it back in June when we've got more time. So if you like, that's what we want to do, and I'll try and keep the discussion moving as much as possible as we move it through. So I think without further ado then, Celine, we will move into the first section, and I think what Celine will do will just be to focus you on any key changes or areas that she's really looking for input from, that we haven't already discussed or whatever. Just to check, is everybody clear on the process before we move in, actually? So just wanted to check understanding on that, because we do want to make sure we pick up as many comments as possible. Okay, I think we're good with that, Celine. So move us into the first section then.
Okay, thanks, Ian. So just to add, yeah, as Ian suggested, if we keep our comments succinct and clear, I think what will be really helpful for staff will be very clear articulation of the proposal. We have a lot of issues. If you have proposal on how to approach it or the rationale behind it, will really help us to take it away and hopefully better address your concerns and the challenges that we have. And then also just to add any editorial comments, certainly happy to take those offline separately, same timeline as the measurement ED. If you could send editorials to us by end of next week, the 24th. All right, so I will go into section by section. So we'll start with objective and scope. We talked about objective and the overall objective in March again, and so we've tried to capture that in the basis of conclusions and the discussion that we had in March. The objective and scope you saw in December, we talked about it in March, so hopefully not too many surprises here. Maybe more just a question on articulation of the objective and any questions on the scope. I think that's the main areas for objective and scope. So you'll look at paragraphs 1 to 5 and then basis for conclusions. So,
okay, thanks, Celine. So open up for comments. So I think Mike, you were first, and then Patricia, and then Lucy.
So thank you, Chair. I pretty much agree with that long-term fiscal sustainability includes the delivering of services. But however, I think that term fiscal itself leads to the misunderstanding that our disclosure requirements, they relate to financial issues only. So you've got to read the definition afterwards. As this paragraph on objective, I think it's one of the most important things on our project and our draft. I strongly suppose that we already at that second para include a reference that the service delivery is included, just to avoid any misunderstanding. It's this very prominent part of our project.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So go to Patricia, then Lucy, then Angela.
And thank you. But my first comment is related to the previous comment, that some relevant outcomes is out of this the scope of this. Considering the definition, then I need check with the outcomes. It's out of scope. Initially, I disagree, but specifically about the two objectives. In the first one, not our entity is responsible for analyze the fiscal sustainability, and in some cases, entity has the burden for the changes so high, and I can consider the kind of entities that consider the kind of fiscal sustainability or consideration about the feasibility to continue handling services, revenue, and that. And then I think it's a different approach for different entities. Maybe it's a financial condition is better than fiscal sustainability. Fiscal sustainability is connected in some way with a cash. If cash not accrual basis, is cash basis not accrual basis in some jurisdiction. I think it's need better articulate this fact that in some jurisdiction fiscal sustainability is related to measure based on cash basis and non-accrual basis. The other point, the other objective, I think.
Sorry, Patricia, if I can just add in at that point, I think there is some useful drafting on this and how it works at different levels in RPG1. So I think if we can say to staff, if you can have another look at what's in RPG1 and bring in what's appropriate to help with that point about, because fiscal did come up, the use of that term did come up quite a lot when we were doing RPG1, and so there is some drafting that sort of explains what we mean and how it can relate to different levels. So I think we have that as a specific instruction, because clearly it's still causing some issues. So Patricia, back to you.
Okay, and the second objective, the objective is where an entity has climate-related policy activities. I have the comments about policy activity, but I will make during the in the section about the definition. The outcomes that could reasonably be expected as a result of these. And when I check the draft try to mirror in the S2 requirements, and S2 requirement is about risk and opportunities and analysis of scenarios. And then I think it's not the objective is not coherent with the content in the draft, because risk and opportunities is relevant in this draft. I think it's necessary to reconsider the item B, 2B, because the objective is not the object does not reflect the content in the draft. And okay, it's my comment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Patricia. So I'm going to go to Lucy next, then Angela, Andrew, and Fabienne.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just noticed that in objective paragraph 2B, we were clear that the outcomes that could, the standard would apply to outcomes that could reasonably be expected as a result of the climate-related policy activities. So for consistency, I think paragraph 3C should also be revised to be consistent with that, because when we say and their related outcomes, so that would include both expected, those that can be reasonably be expected, and those that could not reasonably be expected, which is made clear in paragraph 4. So I think we just have to be clear on that by revising paragraph B.C. under scope. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. So Angela, and then Andrew and Fabienne.
Thanks, Ian. The main concern under the objective and scope was it was the narrowing of policy activities to climate-related policy activities. It may be that I didn't follow this last year before I was a member, but it seems to me that the outcomes that could be expected as a result of climate-related policy activities is actually a very narrow subset of policies that government entities and governments set. So I guess I had imagined that the standard would look at or consider policies that are not necessarily intended to address a specific climate action, but nevertheless are significant policies that will nevertheless have an impact on the climate, particularly greenhouse gas emissions. And so, for example, if a government has decision processes around policies, they may not be directly specifically related to a climate policy, but how does that government or that government reporting entity think about the impact of climate from a particular policy? Now, I'm a bit conflicted because policies, government policies are very wide, and to operationalize the standard, we're going to have to do something around practicalities and narrowing and somehow making it manageable, the policies we talk about. But I guess I just wanted to raise that, was this an explicit decision to only talk about climate-related policies under the policy arm of this ED? Was that explicitly debated and decided, or is it through this drafting that it's become clear the policy side of this disclosure ED is just focused on those policies related to climate? Because I guess in many jurisdictions, there'll be quite a limited number of policies. So it's really a question drawn out from the clarity in the drafting, which I hadn't appreciated. But having said that, it's a challenge. It's an absolute challenge on how you make the policy activity disclosures manageable. And it does have to be narrowed in some way, like only major government policies. How does the government consider climate impacts with those, even though they're not labelled climate-related policy?
Oh, I think, Angela, yes, we are narrowing it to climate-related policies, because the instruction from various different groups was make sure this is a climate-related standard. And I think that anything could have an impact on climate just doesn't, you can't handle that. I think the reassurance, and this is probably around communication, is if a policy does have an impact on climate, it will have an impact through the activities, the own operations of government, or it will be picked up through broader reporting in the economy. So I think we need to articulate that better in terms of our explanation of what we're actually doing here. But I think it all comes back to, what are you accountable for in relation to climate related activities? Are they doing what you expected it to or not? And be clearer about that. And I think we just have to make sure we communicate that, because we can't possibly, this is just not going to be practical if we take that very broad, totally all-encompassing, and it just doesn't fit with the rest of our literature that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to move on then to Andrew, Fabienne, Mike and Liang.
Thanks, Ian. I also had a challenge, I guess, around policy activities, and initially had Angela's thoughts, and I do have to keep stopping myself to say it's got to be narrower, it's got to be implementable. This is the first step. It's not the last step in the journey, I guess, as well. I guess I had other comments around policy activities, but I'll pick that up in the definitions. I think it more relates to that, and maybe it's going too broad. The comment I wanted to raise is not necessarily on the scope and the objective per se, but it's on how we structure the standard itself. Because reading through this myself and having local discussions, we struggle to kind of see what were my activities versus what were the policy related parts of the standard. It was difficult to try and disentangle those within the standard. And so the suggestion or the consideration is, do we perhaps have an S2 aligned standard that only deals with my activities, and in a separate sort of an appendix have the policy related activities later on, because that's then a very public sector specific part. I think it makes it easier to identify where you are within it and disentangle what disclosures are required. I think it also helps when you look at interoperability, because then this part is clearly aligned with S2. You can see the interoperability of it. This is my public sector specific part. And this part might also then be easier to relate and link up with my performance information that I've got as well. So it was just a consideration around how we package the standard and potentially trying to make it easier for people to understand, or to look at those interoperability considerations. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. I mean, I think we are going to have to look at, because it's long, so how do we help people really get the overview on that? And there may be some issues, particularly in strategy, about whether we have all the length in the core text versus I think we do need to be quite careful about, because policy activities is a major difference for the public sector, the optics of just relegating that to an appendix, not, potentially for good reasons, but I think there are some optics around this is a standard for the public sector, and therefore so I think if we can hold that one for now and see what we can do in terms of the navigation around the rest of the standard, because I do think we need to be, people need to see, well, if I'm mainly operating in the policy arena, where's the guidance for me? So if we hold that one, but I think we do need to think about navigation, and maybe that's one to come back to in June. Fabienne, and then Mike, and then Liang.
Thanks, Jan. That was exactly the point I was going to make in the wake of Andre's and your comment, Jan, just now. Policy setting activities are definitely a specific area for the public sector, and reading the standard, and again, there's been a lot of progress and a lot of work done here, so well done. But reading the standard and structure as of now, I found that the disclosure requirements for policy setting activities were a bit sort of buried in each section after, I wouldn't say behind, but after the own operations. And I think you may, I guess the board may want to think about it a bit more in terms of in the public interest and clear communication on that, because usually those entities that have public sector, that are in a position to have public setting activities, are usually prominent entities. And as you said, Jan, they may want to look at where are the disclosures they have to make, and they can't be after, they may not have to be after the own operations. It may have to be separated a bit more. As you said, it's a case of navigating the standard better. And those entities may be under a lot of scrutiny as well. So it has, somehow I guess it has to be made as prominent as the own operation. So I guess there's something really to do around that. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Fabienne. We might think about, can we make the structure discussion something where we do get some input from the CAG on for June? That might be helpful. We need to think about, can we, Mike, and then Liang.
So I have a comment. I can comment now on the definition section. I just want to underline what Angela touched on, because I'm really struggling with, let's say, excluding all the other policy work, because I think that's a very important topic when you are dealing with public sector specific climate related disclosures. So the my question is, and I think I brought it in the last in-person session. I think it was an answer from you. I say, okay, that could be included in the own operations. And in the meantime, I agreed to that. But nevertheless, I think we should make within the standard clear that own operations might or may include non-climate related policies as well, because now own operations is defined as just excluding any policy activities, and there we have a really gap in that. Thank you.
Okay, Mike. So I think there's an instruction there to have a look at that, how that definition works, and maybe that does actually address both your point and Angela's point by being clear about that. And we might want to explain that better in basis for conclusions, or possibly other forms of guidance as well, to make sure that that gets communicated. Liang.
Actually, when I listened to Angela and other members' comment, actually, one question is always in my mind. That is, this should be outcome of climate-related policy activities, or maybe we say in another way, climate-related outcome of policy activities. My point is actually for some policy, actually maybe when such as a city government, such as to decide to establish a subway, actually its policy, the initial purpose is not related to climate. Maybe it's just want to resolve the transportation, the traffic problem in the city. But when the subway has been established, actually people may take more subway rather than to take vehicles. And in that way, actually the climate, the emission will be reduced. So actually, in my point of view, this initially it may not be a climate-related policy, but it has climate-related outcome of the policy. So maybe we may consider whether we change the way to say it is climate-related outcome of the policy activities. Thank you.
I mean, I can see I can see where your concerns come from, but I think it comes back into what is actually deliverable, because if you go that route, then you basically broaden it right out again. And actually, in your example, Liang, the impact would come through actually when you operationalize, basically when the subway gets operating, it would have an impact. So I think we need to think about that one further, but I think we have to come back to this has to be practical, and bringing in potentially everything just is not going to make it operable for public authorities. So I think, I've got this tension in mind that we keep getting told it's got to be, this is a climate related standard. So I think we're going to have to draw a line around this, and maybe it's just in how we communicate it. So I think you're going to have to let us take that one away and have some further discussions on that. And we do have a climate topic working group coming up. So I think this will clearly be a topic we need to feed into that. Renee, and then I'm going to move us on to the next section.
Yes. This conversation or the comment that Liang brought up is just triggered the thinking that was going on in the back of my mind as well. I understood part of her comment anyway to be more tightening up what we mean by outcomes. I tried to search through the current draft. I mean, I know we're saying outcomes on society, but for me, climate-related outcomes, if there's a way to clarify that we're in a climate standard, so we're talking about policy activities as it relates to impacting or outcome on the climate, and outcome on climate or outcome on the environment, but is implied in outcome on society. So to me, it's trying to further articulate that outcome on society here in the context of that particular standard means outcome that impact climate-related outcomes and outcomes that impact the environment. So I still think we're saying the same thing. It's just that we're further articulating and refining what we mean by outcomes. So I see this as a refinement, not an enlargement, the way that I'm thinking about it. So I would welcome additional maybe AG to explain that refinement.
Thanks, Renee. I think we're going to have to think about what we put in the context of what you just described, and I think there may be, this is where we might want to think about, does do the concepts, does the model used for integrated reporting actually help us? Because that is a very clear deliberative process, which is inputs, outputs, outcomes, and it ties it together in a way, and that does fit with the accountability framework that we have, accountability and decision making. So I think we're going to need to have a further thought, as you say, and as members have expressed. I think we now understand the concerns that you've got, and we're going to have to balance that with what is actually going to be capable of operation, and maybe we have to be explicit about that it's not going to cover absolutely everything. So I think we hear the concerns, and I think that's been really helpful, and thank you to members as well for being succinct as we've looked at that. So I think, Celine, move us into the next section.
So the next section is definitions. So paragraph 6, I think a number of the definitions are climate related, taken from S2. Certainly the key items that will be open for discussion, the definitions on policy activities and own operations. So the approach we took was sort of policy activities. We based that off of aligning it with GHG protocol policy and action standard, which is something we are thinking we will look to develop the metrics section of the standard. And so aligning their definitions and all of the different types of policy tools that can be included in policies, and then own operations being essentially the residual, all other activities. So that's our thinking, and just to give a little bit more color on the GHG protocol policy and action standard, which we'll get more into in June. It is a standard that we would think about for reporting on GHG emissions. How do you think about the like Andrew said, sort of the downstream effect of your policies? What are those GHG and non-GHG effects through different stages, sort of and how do you attribute those back to your policy? And so with that sort of lens and that existing guidance, we were thinking we would align the definition of policies so that you would be easily relatable and applicable for translating through reading through our document. So that's, I'll pause there and really focusing probably on those two definitions, but any other comments are welcome.
Celine, I can see, reading the definition, I can see the general challenge that members are having, which is partly that actually what we've done is to try and define policy activities as opposed to climate related policy activities. And I think we need to be clear about how those two interact, and whether we actually tie it down to climate related policy activities or so I think that's where some of listening to the comments and looking now at what's there, I can see where some of the confusion is coming from, and in a way, what you've got in policy activities actually includes some of the specifics around what are climate-related policy activities. So linking to the GHG protocol there for policy and actions. So I think we just need to kind of tease that apart and be clear about how we're using those two. Any other points that members wanted to make that haven't come out so far on either that dichotomy between policy activities and own operations or more generally? Mike.
So just a minor comment. I found it in an agenda paper on 2.2.2 very helpful to clarify that outputs also include policy activities, and hence my suggestion would be that we would also include that in the definition section. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Andrew, then Patricia.
Thanks, Ian. And maybe it's because we've started the policies with reference to GHG, but I struggled with everything from information instruments towards the latter part of the definition. It kind of felt to me like, you know, I as a public sector entity could undertake an intervention within my own environment, you know, with different information instruments, implementation of a new technology. You know, if I implement a more efficient printer, that falls within the definition of this, but it's clearly not what we want to try and achieve here. So I think just we need to rework this definition. I don't think GHG, perhaps it's a good starting point, but we definitely need to try and get it right. And this is the point where I said, I think it's maybe too broad at the moment rather than narrowing it down. Thanks.
Sandra, I think that's helpful. Patricia.
Thank you. Regarding the policy activities, initially I disagree with the alignment with GHG protocol because it's considered narrow instruments for policy activities and also kind of other instruments like for example, policies relate to handling services. I think in this case, I disagree with the GHG protocol policies. Specifically, I think I need a definition, what it includes and not, and consequently, I can define the only operation for the exclusion. I think in this stage, it's not possible. What is in fact is in the policy activity and not its only operations. The other point, in 2 points, I think it's need to consider. The first one, policy activities only about the setting policies because policy activities relate to implementation of activities too. And in this moment, it seems that it's only setting policies. It's not to implement policies because implement policies is related to only operations of the entities. The second point, when I'm setting policies, the policies affect the entity too. It's not only others, the policies affect entity too. I think this is a problem in this definition. And the other point that it appears in the draft, it's a few entities setting policies. It's not true because, for example, in relation to the tax legislation, all levels of government can issue tax legislation in accordance with the tax competences in each jurisdiction. But I think it's not true considering the examples of the policies. Some it's not a few entities that has policy activities. I need to think more about this. And considering that the setting policy activities affects the entity itself, I think it needs more articulation with the some definitions, for example, climate relation transition risks, because the policies is set by the entity itself. It's not it's external source of information. It's the entity considering the effect in itself when establishing some policies. This is my main concerns about this area here. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. So I think that point, we do need to articulate not only what is the split between climate-related policies as a subset of overall policy activities and own operations. And I think you're right, Patricia, we need to be clear that actually if you have a policy that can impact on your own operations as much as others, it certainly seems that I think the diagram or perhaps the development of that we've been using around policy activities may well be helpful to include that in the basis for conclusions. So I think given the amount of debate that we've had around this and the definition and getting the communication right, I think if we can instruct staff that we do need a specific paper on this to reflect the changes proposed in terms of those definitions, and then being clear about how those have been rippled through both application guidance and BCs and anything else. Because if we can satisfy ourselves that we're clear and we've got this nailed, then we'll be able to communicate that for constituents, and it'll be they'll be able to, hate to say operationalize it, but you know what I mean, apply the guidance. Mary.
Yes, thank you. I have the same view with Patricia, and I'm in confusion about the distinction between the own operation and policy activities. And from my point of view, there is so many issues, climate-related opportunities and climate-related plans and risks. And from my point of view, it is closely related to the program or project, and so it is program and project is a kind of policy activities or not. That is my basic question. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. I think we note the point, and it does come back to being clear about this point. There's one of those. It's the crux of the standard, I think, getting that articulation clear. So we'll need to specifically focus on that in June, I think, and it's been very helpful getting those comments out from members. So I think we're now roughly in the middle of the meeting. What I'd suggest before we move on further into subsequent sections is that we take a break at this point. And what I'd suggest is that we come back at 10:02. So that's just under a quarter of an hour's break. So go and get some refreshments, take a break, and then we will come back at 10:02. And as ever, I'll ask David if he can give us a warning and then, essentially tell us when the break's up. Okay, thanks everyone. See you shortly. Okay, everyone. If we then move into the next section, and we're moving on now to consider governance. And of course, it's across core text, application guidance, and basis for conclusions. Celine, any introductory comments on that in terms of key points to focus on?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So the governance section, based on the discussions at the breakout groups, the folks, board members, technical advisors, observers kind of felt that governance, though the context and structures may be different, in general, they're fairly similar to private sector. And so the approach taken is that the IFRS S2 disclosure requirements for governance apply for own operations and policy activities. And so application guidance is provided in AGs 1 to 3 to elaborate on the public sector context, addressing the points raised in some of the breakout discussions. And then there's BCs 36 to 38 that speak to the background and the decisions there. And so I think the key questions to highlight are really, are there any other disclosure requirements needed for public sector specifically, or application guidance for governance?
Okay, so open for comments from members on the governance sections, core, AG, and BC. Yeah, Mike, lead us off.
So thank you, Chair. Just two brief comments. I understand that this is copied more or less one-on-one from IFS, but nevertheless, as we define it for the first paragraph of the governance section and for the strategy section as well, there it is limited to financial disclosures by wording, and our objective is a little bit different, as we don't have that financial focus, so we understand our disclosures in a broader way. So my suggestion would be to, for the objectives for both sections, to remove that financial, just mentioning the disclosures. That is the first one. The second one that relates also to what we discussed before the break is that we, at certain points, their policy activities appear here in para 10, and so it's not really clear whether that is climate policy related or it's policy in general. So my suggestion for that were to run through the entire document to make clear, is it policy in general or is it a policy just related to climate change?
Thanks, Mike. Useful points. Angela, and then Lucy.
Thanks, Ian. I know through the breakout groups, I think there was a lot of views that governance is not that different in the public sector from the private sector. Therefore, we bring in S2, and I think that works probably reasonably well on own operations. So I just wanted to flag or raise a concern around the policy activity side of governance, because I actually think the public sector is quite different from the private sector, not only in the fact that we do policy, but the way it's done. And if I think about, ultimately Parliament and government and the executive and determining policies and then delegation of responsibilities, and it's a system where there are many actors, and the expectation is that the private sector and the individuals also change their behaviour as a result of policy intervention or a policy program. And so I think it would be helpful to have more of the flavour in the application guidance to kind of acknowledge what we know about the public sector around jurisdictions, rather than be very vanilla based on the S2 kind of corporate governance. So And I think that then led me to another question just to log, is that, I understand why our disclosure requirements in 9 for policy activities, I can see just points us straight back to all the disclosures from S2 on the basic sort of governance. And I just wondered, when you really think about, I guess, my first point, does that lead you to actually a different, not all of those disclosures, or slightly different nuanced disclosures or different disclosures? Because I think there is a difference in the public sector when it comes to governance of those policy activities, which then would lead me to actually, I think maybe we need to think about disclosures and just putting them back to the governance disclosures for own operations effectively. I think we might be missing something there in terms of public sector differences.
Thanks, Angela. I mean, I think certainly some of the discussion in the AGs is intended to do that, but clearly there's a bit more richness, and we need to balance, the trying to get the general concept over. I think then the question really becomes probably, so I might suggest that staff have a further think about the drafting, and then perhaps, if you can input to that, that would be helpful. I think there's probably a challenge back, which is, yes, the governance very often is different because it'll be multi-department and all that kind of thing. But actually, if you tie this to, okay, the governance needs to be there because you've got a program that or an activity that you're trying to achieve change through, the processes and the intentions probably are the same. The question, I think, and the pushback to you is, okay, what is it that is missing from an S2 type of approach? If we get the reflection of the different ways in which this operates right in the AG, what is it that's missing from the disclosures? Because I've certainly run that thought process through my mind, and I was actually reasonably happy that if we got the AG right, then probably the core text requirements would fit into place. Okay, so I think that's not for now, but I think that's have a think about that. And I think there is a discussion there. Let's get the drafting in the AG right, and then let's see if there is anything that then leaps out. Lutfi, next.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I agree that governance could be based on IFRS S2. But as we have discussed, a public sector entity which is a climate related policy sector could also be impacted by its own operation, could also be impacted by its climate related policies. So I think that should be also disclosed in paragraph 8, because here we only mention about the risks and opportunities, but we did not take into consideration the impacts of its climate-related policy on its own operation. Although there is paragraph 9, but it is entirely different because this is about climate-related policy activities. But when the climate-related policy activity of an entity would impact on its own operation, and that should also be disclosed in paragraph 8. Thank you.
So I think we need to be careful not to introduce double counting here. So certainly I think we need to make it clear at that point about an entity's own operations being impacted by policies. But I think we need to be clear what would be reported through the impact of the policies more broadly across sectors versus, so that would be, let's say, a reduction in greenhouse gases versus actually what are the greenhouse gas emissions from that organization, which would not only would reflect a whole series of internal as well as external decisions. So I think we have to be careful not to double count, and B, not to over elaborate. So I think if we have a look at how we make that clear, and Yeah, I think it's about clarity to make sure we haven't missed anything, but equally we haven't double counted. Mari.
Yes, thank you. My question is about the former question. It's the paragraph 10. If the latter of the paragraph is if oversight of its own operations and its policy activities are managed.
Mari, do you mind speaking a bit closer to the mic? I'm certainly having challenge listening.
Yes. It's paragraph 10. It's on. It is based on the IFRS 2 paragraph 7. However, it is not easy to understand because the operation, its own operations and oversight of its operations and its policy activities are managed on an integrated basis. My concern is an integrated basis, but maybe it is related to the distinction between its own operations and policy activities, and it is not easy to understand. Thank you.
Thanks, Mari. Other points on governance?
Yes, governance.
Okay. So I think we can move on then from governance into strategy.
Right, so strategy is an area that was definitely highlighted as a major area of difference. So there is a lot of new public sector specific guidance on strategy. So I'll just share the different sections to help break it down. So we have the guidance and requirements for an entity's own operations, paragraphs 11 to 12, and then AG's paragraphs 4 to 31, and that's all that's largely leveraging S2. So all of the sections are aligned with S2, and we provide additional application guidance. So I think on thinking about and discussing own operations, any comments on that alignment and anything additional needed for public sector, and particularly on the application guidance. That's most of that application guidance for sections are new for public sector context. S2 only provides application guidance on scenario analysis, so that climate resilience section, which we are leveraging for public sector as well. And then on the policy activities, so we focused on areas of policy activities. The structure, based is in a sense mirroring what we have on own operations. We talk about the general strategy for climate related policy activities in paragraph 24, and then AG's 32 to 33. And then the current and anticipated financial effects of climate related policy activities, and in paragraph 25, with some application guidance in paragraphs 34 and 36. And then climate resilience is around the scenario analysis that informs policy activities and policy setting. So that's paragraphs 26 and 27. And the AGs in this case really a little addition refers back to some of the guidance and framing for scenario analysis of own operations, but in the context for policy activities. So without getting into further detail, I'll pass it back to Ian.
Okay, thanks, Celine. So just hold the slide there for a moment. So I think because there's a lot of material here, what I'd like to do is pick up members' comments on entities' own operations and the application of S2 there, and then let's pick up the points on policy activities. And I think if we take it as read that when we get into policy activities, those points around clarification and the general point around clarification is going to have to be fixed. So we'll take those as incremental comments. So if we can look at entities, the text on strategy for an entity's own operations first, and I'll open up for comments on that. We'll get comments on that, and then I'll go to strategy for policy activities. Okay, so if we open for comments on entities' own operations. Yeah, Andrew first.
Thanks, Ian. In paragraph 20, we've got something, and I acknowledge it comes directly from S2 around if an entity does not have the skills, capability, or resources to provide quantitative information, it doesn't need to do so. I did wonder whether such a low threshold would be appropriate for the public sector, given our broader mandate and higher accountability thresholds. I think it possibly works better in the private sector where markets will hold you to account if you've got that material information or it is material to you, and it will be done very quickly. I'm not necessarily convinced the same enforcement mechanisms work as well in the public sector, and so whether we should just revisit that threshold and raise the bar a little bit. And while I'm on that point, it does tie back into the policy activities. I know you don't want to go there, but my question is, does the same threshold apply on the policy activity side? Because there I don't think it should apply at all. I think if you are a policy, you have to provide this as part of your main operations, and just that wasn't clear to me. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew. I think that's a good point on both counts. And I think we ask staff to take a look at that and come back with proposals on that, because I understand your point about public accountability there on those. I think it's well made. Angela.
Thanks, Ian. I just really wanted to log, and again, I haven't thought about what to do about it or solve it, but in para 22, it brings in the entity shall use climate-related scenario analysis to assess its climate resilience. It does talk about an approach that's commensurate with the entity circumstances. I guess I have a fundamental concern about a whole lot of small agencies in a system of government doing scenario analysis. So it's a very practical point. I think it's pretty costly. I don't think it's that helpful. I feel the scenario analysis would need to be done at a higher level in the government system, whether at a sector or a regulatory system level or something. I haven't thought about the answer, but it's the mandatedness of it in the public sector, even in own operations. That's before we even get to policy activities. I just have really large concerns about that requirement. So I'll just log that there, and I'd quite like to do more thinking on it myself as to, but yeah, it's problematic for me in terms of a standard that can be implemented and it makes sense, because I think for a lot of agencies or a lot of individual agencies, it doesn't make sense in the government environment.
Yeah. I can understand the point you're making on that. So I think if we instruct staff to go away and have a think about that, and in terms of proposed changes in terms of that requirement, whether we can work around it in terms of additional application guidance on this, or whether we need to go further on that. I think if staff can have a think about that and then perhaps have an offline discussion with you on that. Angela, Ross, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I do think we'll need some help on this, Angela, in your thinking. So after you think it through, I think if we're going to do this in a principled way, we're going to have a little bit more thought on what you think might be an appropriate way forward. Because I really do struggle at our level doing an international standard for us to start to tell people how you would implement it at a level. And I do think I struggle a lot. So I'm assuming your point relates to own operations only, not policy decisions. So maybe I just want to clarify that point.
Yeah, I was focused on that. I hadn't, only because we were focused on own operations, but that does sort of lead me to the question of what does that mean on the other side of policy activities. But yeah, it's a tricky one. It's a kind of who reports rather than what you report. In a way, it's going to kind of, you know, but I guess potentially I can sort of see if a jurisdiction was to pick up the standard, it may be that jurisdiction's regulator says carves out sections of the standard, you know, in a practical sense, because I think it comes back to, I think the public sector, we might have undercooked the public sector as different to the private sector in where we've got to. I mean, I've agreed with many of they're not that different when you look at elements, but when you look at a government system, sorry, I won't waste time. I'll come offline and I'll think about it properly. I was just conscious of logging it, and I was unsure if others had thought about it or whether, you know, you've clearly thought about it, but it's a tricky one. I accept that.
I think it's a well-made point, Angela, and it may well be, for example, that actually what we need to do is actually say, and I think it goes to the point you made in that intervention, which is actually in terms of the nature of how the public sector is organised, it may well be that you know, there is a particular information set, or, you know, bodies are mandated to draw on a central analysis or something like that. So there may well be something like that. And I think what I would suggest in the first instance is let's just raise this as a point for the climate topic working group to have a go at, because we've got 3 different jurisdictions inputting there. And then let's just have a think about the circumstances on how that might happen. Because I think it is a good point, and we clearly don't want to have multiple scenario analysis going on all over the place, which is all in the same space, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think good point, and we will take it away, and I think we'll probably have the relevant discussions through climate topic working group, but potentially also sort of offline with you. Celine, did you want to add to that before I go to Patricia?
I just wanted to jump in because, Angela, I think we had a similar discussions came up in some of the breakout groups and thinking. And so I think if you're thinking about it further, have a look. I think just scrolling through, I think AG 22 tries to address it. You know, not every single, you may be at a, you know, smaller entity level or a borough or something, and you may leverage a higher level of government scenario analysis. That's something that we tried to consider and address in that way. And if that you had still some uncertainty around or any idea, let us know. But we did have some thinking around that, and it did come up at the discussion before.
Thanks, Celine. So I think let's just have a think about whether we need to elaborate on that further, because it's clearly not logged. And also we may need to just, you know, put a hook in the core text or something like that as well. So let's have a think about what we think we're aiming to get done, and then what the guidance needs to actually do, and where we need to put that in the text. It does sound like it's mainly an AG issue, but anyway, Patricia.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. The first one is the objective is related to fiscal sustainability, and the fiscal sustainability has 3 dimensions: service, revenue, and debt. And when I consider the paragraph here, the paragraph is related to financial statements. Okay, financial statement give me information about the service and revenue and debt, but I think it needs more to be better articulated in the text, considering what RPG1 said and what this draft says. The other
Patricia,
point
just to check on that. So do you have specific points where you're looking for changes in drafting, or I understand the general concern and we would need to look at that, but I just wanted to check, is that a general comment that we need to watch on, or are there particular areas that you want to highlight for staff? Because if so, that's fine. But I just wanted to check on that before you move to your second point.
Yes, my point is about the paragraph 15, because paragraph 15, it's about the variables related to financial condition, because sustainability focus on the service capacity, capacity to handle service, and the revenue in that. And here is the number in financial statements. So for example, financial performance, and financial performance does not directly indicate me the capacity to handle service. I think it's need to better articulating this point.
Good. Thanks.
Yes.
So your second point?
Yes, my second point is the fiscal sustainability. There is the connection between operation, own operations in the information, disclosed information about own operations, and the policy activities, because sometimes government can't activity outcomes because of this fiscal restriction. Then I think it's necessary to articulate better the information about the own operations and the information about the outcomes from I think outcomes, because I think it decides about the kind of outcomes. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Patricia. Okay, so anything else then in terms of strategy and own operations? Then we've got a couple of points from Andrew and Angela, which kind of also overlap into policy activities. Mary.
Yes, thank you. My concern is about anticipation, and how to anticipate the effect of the climate related. So is it guidance, or maybe they clarify the anticipate, how to anticipate the effect? Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. I think that's a good point, and maybe we need to. There's a balance, isn't there? Because this is reporting guidance, but I think to your point, essentially, I know from my own jurisdiction there is a requirement for, for example, for a regulatory impact assessment right up front before you as part of, both primary and secondary legislation. So that does imply that kind of more deliberative process, and I think it comes into investment appraisal and so on. So we need to work out, and it's probably basis for conclusions, what we say around that point, that this is a reporting standard, but it and probably this is where it pushes the boundaries, as it were, with governments, that they need to think about that up front, and then they need to design the governance strategy, risk management processes, and the metrics. So it's around the application, but it's around, your point is then, I think, around up front. We just need to think about that. Okay. Anything else then as picking up on strategy and policy activities? Okay, that's good. Patricia.
Yes, true. I think the discussion about the scenario analysis is different for policy activities. In some jurisdiction, scenario analysis is not the way to decide about the set some policies. I think you need to think more about this. And the other point is the text in paragraph. Can I check here? Paragraph 25. sorry, I'm not sure about the paragraph, but it's near here. But the question is sometimes it's a paragraph mentioned the fact that if the policy activity is funded or not. But in some kinds of policy activities, increase revenue or decrease revenue, it's not necessary need to fund. Then I think it's need to better articulate this too. Thank you.
That's helpful. Thanks, Patricia. Okay. So not seeing any other hands raised on strategy and policy activities. So I think, Celine, then we move into risks and opportunities, or sorry, risks, opportunities, outcomes.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Ian. So moving on to risk and outcome management. So there's some paragraphs there. I think it's similar to the governance approach based on the discussions through the breakout sessions. I think the overall response was that risk management and the risk management process is very much aligned, between public and private sector and how we manage risks. But it's really, at the end of the day, the types of risks that are managed that are significantly different. So in terms of the disclosure requirements, we've aligned those with S2 between own operations and policy activities, which essentially tell us about your processes to manage risk and opportunities, and now outcomes. And then application guidance is net new to provide the context of public sector. So if there's any comments generally on primarily on the application guidance or any other disclosure requirements needed.
Okay, thanks, Celine, for that. So open up for comments on that section from members. Not seeing any hands raised at that point. Yeah, Lucy.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. No, it's just a question on the title, risk and outcome management. Shall we not include opportunities, because in paragraph 29, 29B, there were also discussion about how to identify, assess, prioritize, and monitor climate-related opportunities. Thank you.
Okay. Celine, you okay with that? Okay. Thanks for that, Lucy. Okay. So I think if there are no other comments on that section, then that moves us through into the appendix on general requirements and conceptual foundations. So Celine, do you want to just introduce that, and then we'll open up for comments on that?
Yeah, so this is Appendix B and Appendix BAG. So you'll have seen most of this in December. So we're bringing it back, and I think we'll focus on really the incremental changes. So a lot of the updates were made to reflect the initial review in December, and new paragraphs added have been sort of to incorporate the shift in thinking that we've had since December, thinking about bringing in outcomes, examples, and thinking about own operations versus policy activities. So you'll see various new paragraphs and examples, and then really those sections have shaped my understanding and entity's context, section, thinking about how you think through and identify climate-related risks and opportunities, what are climate-related outcomes. And then when we get into materiality, there's not much content that has changed, but we'll work with member to sort of try to streamline that guidance to make it really more applicable across risks and opportunities and outcomes rather than feeling kind of different parts in different sections. So that's more just streamlining. And then, yeah, I think those are the main areas of updates. So I think I'd like to turn it over, Ian, if there's any comments on the incremental changes since December.
Thanks for that, Celine. So perhaps, yeah, really, I'll open for comments on both the, if you like, the core part of Appendix B, and then the but the application guidance along that alongside that. Yeah, Angela.
Thanks, Ian. And yeah, and just a shout out again to Celine and the staff. There's a lot of good material in this document. I think that's a good thing, but I guess it's the point's been made already. This is very long. Sometimes it feels slightly repetitive to ideas in previous sections. So it's without coming up with solutions. It's how, and I know this is the first time we've sort of seen it sort of together, but I'm conscious that more sections need to be added as well. So yeah, I really support the drafting group, and yeah, I think we've got a bit of a job to bring this together. Yeah, it's trying to get simple, getting it simple, but reflective of what our ideas are or what the requirements are, providing enough guidance and clarity. But I think this is the challenge of bringing so many resources together to create one product. But thank you, Celine, for all the work that's going in, and others.
Thanks, Angela. I think it's always good to get that appreciation for what staff have done. I think we are going to have to think about the placement of material in terms of how you navigate it and what it means in terms of application. And certainly that was Andrew's point earlier on in terms of, what's in the main body versus what's in an appendix. I think there's also some reflection perhaps we need on, for example, I know my own bugbear is how much in the strategy section do we have in the main text, or, do we actually put the high level requirements in terms of the things you need to think of, which is one of the paragraphs in S2, and move a lot of the detail then into the application guidance, which, if you look at S2 on the website, actually basically you can avoid getting into all of that detail by clicking on the button which unscrolls it all. So I think we just need to sort of think a bit more about those sorts of things, because as you say, Angela, there is a lot of material, and it's really how do we help people see the wood for the trees, if you'll pardon a natural resources pun there. So yeah, Liang, to you.
Thanks, Chair. Actually, I have a comment about the BC part, maybe related to the general requirement. Actually, I recall we have discussed in the previous board meeting that because currently we have no a standard on general requirement, so we just put this general requirement into the appendix of this standard. I think we need some paragraph paragraph in the BC to state clearly our logical and why currently we put this general requirement into the appendix, and maybe at next stage when we have a standard, or we decided to develop a standard on general requirement, maybe we can just put the appendix here totally into the new drafting standard. This may be need to be stated clearly in our BC.
Yes, I think that's a very important point, and it does go to that making sure we've reflected all the key decisions on the journey, because that does have a very significant impact on any placement of guidance, but just overall length. Okay, that's a good point. Anything else then on that general requirements? Okay, so Celine, I think that walks us through the specifics. I'd like to thank members for the way in which they've approached this review, because I think that's done exactly what we were looking for, which is to kind of flush out those areas very clearly for staff and also for the climate topic working group to focus on in the material that comes back to you in June. I guess at this stage, I just want to give members the opportunity of asking any other questions about, or points they want to make on the development process, just whilst we've got a bit of time here. Yeah, Angela.
Thanks, Ian. There's probably two things I want to raise or log. One is very comfortable with our decision that this scope of the standards based on the reporting entity, but I struggle to see how the standard could be applied by a whole of government, particularly the own operations. I can actually see a sort of whole of government climate policy report, and a number of governments, I believe, are doing that, and maybe it's not that dissimilar to some of the reporting that governments may need to do under the UN protocols or whatever international agreement they're under. So that leads me to a sort of a strategic question around whether the board thinks the standard can be applied by a whole of government, and whether we, in our basis or in our communications. I mean, I think for me, one of the things I have struggled with a little bit is writing one standard that fits all different levels of government, from small agencies through to municipalities, through to whole of government, state governments. And I feel that it's almost an impossible task to write one standard to fit all. That's just a personal sort of angst. So it's really, what do we, as a board, what do we think about that? And what do we want to say about that? And if we're silent, are we potentially running the risks that constituents say, you haven't thought about this? Kind of leads me to the second related issue is that in the early parts of this project, a lot of focus was on sovereign bondholders and their user needs. And, a lot of it was driven out of the fact that sovereign bonds are a really big part of the bond market. And again, I sort of step back and go, will the standard meet the needs of the bond holders? First of all, have we done specific outreach with what are their user needs in preparation to this point? Is there a risk that I think rating agencies who represent the bondholders probably want more country-related risks and opportunities rather than reporting entity. I mean, I don't know. I haven't spoken to them, so I don't know, but I'd be guessing. And therefore, again, given they were such a targeted group and they are part of resource providers, have we thought enough about those two situations? And because I know at the previous meeting we talked about the balancing the need to get something out quickly, but that was a first stage thing, but at the same time trying to develop an ED that people could actually, or reporting entities could implement, and there was a third balancing thing which I can't quite recall. But so there's something around now stepping back, and I know we've still got a lot of work to do. Whole of government, I have real concerns if this is going to be implementable for whole of government. And secondly, a major targeted group which started a lot of the emphasis around this project, are they going to be satisfied, and are their user needs going to be met? So they're questions, don't have the answers, but I just wanted to log those at this stage.
I think on your second question, I think the answer to that, Angela, is the capital markets regulators, both equities and bonds, were actually very heavily involved in the development of S1 and S2. And I think quite reasonably we would say, well, why would you require anything different from governments to private sector bonds? Actually, the thing they probably do need to require, which they don't always, is actually audited accrual-based accounts. But I think it's worthwhile, actually, we can certainly say that. And I think one of the things we'll need to think about in terms of outreach during the consultation is actually, do we specifically address that community in some form of, for example, the Emerging Markets Investors Alliance, type event. So I think if we put that one, we can make that explicit that we've taken that approach in basis for conclusions, and I think we test that through specific stakeholder engagement. On the whole of government, I think that's probably a question that we might want to again just reflect with colleagues at IPSASB on how they've tackled it for groups in the private sector, and make sure that we articulate whether we've basically done it the same way or not. Because I think there are challenges, for example, on scope 3 and so on, which I'm not sure that there is an answer to at the moment. And probably what we don't want to do is take credit for having resolved everything if this is genuinely an issue in the private sector. So I think we'll leave, I think it's a perfectly reasonable question to ask. And I think we just need to check in with IPSASB on their thinking on this and what's resolved and what isn't. And then make sure we've articulated accordingly what we have and haven't done. Two good questions, though. Renee?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I want to build on Angela's comments and reflections. I agree it's a good question to ask. I agree that we need to think about how to operationalize this for governments, for the whole of governments, sovereign governments. But when I reflect on whether we should or not, to me, two reflections is we, as a board, we want to develop standards that are enabling sovereign governments to demonstrate their accountability and their leadership as it relates to fighting climate change. And I would feel that our work would not be complete if we would not carefully develop guidance for the whole of government. I take your point, Chair, too, that it's a consolidation issue to a certain point. How does a consolidated entity report? And the same question exists in the private sector. My other observation is that I do observe many sovereign governments are already setting climate policies, are already taking the leadership role in setting policies, not only to advance climate issues in their own jurisdiction, but to provide guidance to their ministries, agencies that they control, and how do they, as a consolidated group, need to reduce their own carbon footprint and manage their own climate-related risks. So I see it done through policies. I see it done on a consolidated level. I see it done through reporting. So I think it's feasible. But I agree with Angela that we need to develop a standard that will be able to be implemented by those governments. So make sure that we articulate what is different about the government. But I definitely think that we would be missing out if we would not be covering the whole of government, given their leadership and their accountability, the accountability we expect from them.
So I think this goes back to, we'll have a conversation with IPSASB about what they've done on group reporting. I think also what I would suggest is actually let's also revisit this in the context of the presentation that we're trying to tee up for the CAG in June, which is from a sizable government that is already close to having implemented IPSAS, and the way in which they're thinking about approaching implementing essentially what would become our standard on climate-related disclosures. And then I think we need to see what can we at this stage do in terms of this standard versus some example of how do you approach this, versus there are problems with scope 3 and actually consolidating that, and we are not going to be able to solve those ourselves at this stage. So I think let's deal with the art of the possible. We'll be clear from discussions with IPSASB what can and can't be done, and then again, we just have to be honest about this. Maybe there are some issues that haven't been solved at the moment, and the consolidation one and dealing with different, everybody being in and out of each other's scope 3s, that may be a problem we can't solve at the moment. But we can be clear that we're not trying to solve that at the moment. That may be for later. So I think we'll take that one away. I think the practical point, let's revisit that when we've seen the presentation that's being lined up for the CAG in June, which I hope will be very interesting, based on what we've already heard anyway. So I think that's useful. I think let's keep going on those general topics and how do we communicate and so on. We've had a number of points on that already today. I think probably at this point in time, what I'd suggest is that we draw the session to a close, give everybody back their quarter of an hour. Ross, is there anything else you'd like to pick up today, or Celine?
Nothing more other than just to say thanks to everybody, specifically on sustainability. I think this was really helpful and needed for staff to get confirmation on direction, get specific feedback on drafting, and I think that gives us lots to work with going forward. We might reach out to members on some of their comments as we work through it to make sure we're addressing them appropriately. So bear with us if we're asking for some support. I think to get us where we need to be in June, it's going to have to be a fairly iterative process, and we're going to need members to help us out to make sure that we have a good and evolved draft in June that reflects what we heard today and that we're capturing the points effectively. Thank you.
Thanks. I just echo Ross's comments. I'll thank you for taking the time. I know it's a big document. I know it's hard to navigate. I definitely appreciate that. And so thanks for taking the time. I'd like to just remind folks, if you could send me any editorial comments by end of next week. I will be going through, all of our discussion, and as I try to address some comments, I will be in touch. So hopefully in the next 2-3 weeks, we can connect and refine and address some of those before we pre-mail for you to have a look at the next version. So thank you again.
So I think really good session today, really helpful input, just at the right level that we were looking for. And I think, both with measurements and with climate related disclosures, I think today's done what we needed to, which is set us up really well for the discussions that we're going to have, particularly on climate in June, and for approval of the COV application ED in June. So great work, everybody. We will see you again, hopefully the majority of you in person in Toronto in not that many weeks' time, I think. It's probably only about 5 weeks. Am I right on that? I know the staff are kind of counting down to posting deadlines and so on. But hopefully we will see as many people as possible in Toronto. It's a good time of year. And I think it's going to be an interesting meeting. In the meantime, thanks, and see you again soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.